Good morning and welcome to today's Live, where we will be discussing this year's United Nations Climate Conference, otherwise known as COP28, which begins in Dubai. I'm Jonathan Benton, and joining me to discuss the European Parliament's work in combating climate change is the man in charge of leading Parliament's delegation to COP28, Peter Liese. Thank you for joining us today. We will also be putting questions from the audience to Mr. Liese, so if you have anything you'd want to ask him about COP28 or what Parliament is doing about climate change, then please put them in the comments below. Okay, first things first. Can you tell us a bit about COP28? What makes this year's summit different and what are the main goals? How will the EU be represented there?
Yeah, it's a special summit. There are special challenges because the host country is in the Emirates, and the COP president is somebody who is also very strong in the oil business. In fact, he's the president also, not only the minister in Dubai, but he's also the president of the oil company. And this gives us a challenge because we are convinced in the European Parliament we need to phase out fossil fuels to really achieve the climate target that we have all together in the world fixed in Paris. So this is a specific challenge. But there's also a specific opportunity because in my point of view, we have a big problem that the structure of the COP is still from '92. There are the old industrialized countries, and these are the Annex I countries, and then the others all put together, the non-Annex I countries. So that puts Tanzania, Burkina Faso in the same category like China and the Emirates. And China has grown a lot. The Emirates have been rich for decades. And, you know, the first big achievement that was already achieved before the COP is that when it comes to loss and damage, so how to help the people that suffer from climate change, the fund is agreed. And those people that receive the fund, of course, shouldn't be the Emirates and China. It should be Tanzania, Burkina Faso, the Maldives, the people that really suffer and they don't have the money. And here, I think it's historic that we split this category. And I have understood the Emirates will even pledge to contribute. So that is very important. And, you know, there is always black and white and good and bad, but it's not only bad, we have also a huge opportunity here.
I see, so it's about having countries take a fairer share of responsibility for their emissions. Perhaps then you could tell us a bit more about Parliament's role at COP28. How can the Parliament influence negotiations?
Yeah, we have traditionally a delegation that starts in the second week, because in the second week it's a so-called high-level segment when all the ministers arrive and when the final deal is done. And we meet with the negotiators. Very interesting, last year in Sharm el-Sheikh was a meeting with the Chinese negotiator. Without China, we can't mitigate the climate because they are the biggest emitter, not only in total, but also per capita. They are even a bigger emitter than the European Union now. That's why it's so important to convince them to act. And we meet parliamentarians. In China, unfortunately, the parliament has not an important role, but the government has. We meet parliamentarians from the US Senate, from the House, South Africa, Brazil, and all the big players, but for me also very important to meet the representatives of the Marshall Islands, of the Maldives, those countries that disappear if we are not able to control climate change, and to team up with them. You know, European Union should be the partner of those countries that suffer the most because we want ambition, and we need to convince China, United States and others to also do their bit.
I see. So is that about helping everyone around the world, even those most affected, to deal with the challenges and consequences of climate change? Perhaps then you could tell our audience a bit more about what Parliament has done to help tackle climate change recently and its associated challenges. What are the EU's biggest achievements?
Yeah, we have not only agreed on a target, we have a climate law that legally fixes the climate neutrality in 2050. And we have 55% reduction target in 2030. But we have legislation that brings us not only to 55, but to 57. So we will overachieve our target. We have targets for all the sectors, for agriculture, for forestry, to plant more trees, to capture the CO2. And the core of our legislation, a colleague said it's a holy trinity of climate policy. It's the ETS system, a market-based system that everybody who invests in new technologies will be rewarded. And people that want to continue to produce steel or chemicals without looking at the effect, they will have a challenge. So I was the rapporteur for this, and people say it was the biggest climate law ever. We include almost every part of the economy. But this must be accompanied by protection of the industry. We have carbon border adjustment. So when Chinese steel comes to Europe, they either will also decarbonize or they have to pay a fee at the border, so to motivate them also to decarbonize. And we have a social climate fund. That is very, very important because many people cannot afford higher energy prices. They cannot afford heat pumps or electric vehicles. We need to support them. And this has all been agreed at the same day in the European Parliament.
I see. So it's quite a clear line. If you are going to continue polluting, there'll be consequences. But if you are investing in renewables and cleaning the environment, you're rewarded. So I think it brings me to my next point, which is one of the main calls from Parliament with their resolution recently was to end fossil fuel subsidies by 2025, both direct and indirect. What is the current state of subsidies in the EU, and why should they be drastically phased out, and how is it at global level?
Yeah, it is not perfect in the European Union. We still have some fossil fuel subsidies, but in the world it's even worse. So there are countries massively investing in coal, in oil and in gas. We are going down in the European Union, not only with our emissions, but also with the support of these fossil fuels. And it's an important point at the COP that all states in the world need to stop funding fossil fuels. You know, you can spend the money only once. And we want the money to be spent for clean technologies and not for oil, gas and coal.
I see. And another big topic around at the moment, which is, I mean, people believe in climate change and want to support it. However, you can't kind of escape the fact that there's a cost of living and an energy crisis. And people are finding it harder to make ends meet and having to make tough choices. So how can Parliament help to ensure that not only do we convince people to believe in this cause, but also to make sure that no one's left behind in the transition to clean energy?
Yeah, this is really, really important. And there is a danger, and it's growing in the moment, that we lose people's support for the climate policy if we are not really taking them along. And I think 2 points are very important. First of all, supporting those in need. And here we have the Social Climate Fund, that's one thing, but we have also the obligation of member states to distribute the money that they earn from the emission trading. We are broadening the emission trading. It will cover not only industry and electricity, but also shipping or aviation at full scope and heating and transport. And here, of course, people are affected, but we have the obligation that all the money, 100%, must go back to people, and we need to respect social considerations. So, me as an MEP, honestly, I don't need support when I buy an electrical car. But people with lower income, and not only those that are unemployed or pensioners, but also those that do hard work but have a lower than average income, they need more support. And this is an obligation from 2027 in European law, and member states need to follow this. The second point is When we have this challenge, and I think really climate change is the biggest challenge that we have, maybe except the peace and war question that is really currently very important and threatening. But when this is a priority, we need to respect this priority always and everywhere. So the transition will be very expensive if we do not have immediately more renewable energies. So, and sometimes European law that protects birds and insects and whatever stands in the way of a wind park. And I don't think it's useful to have one bird blocking a big wind park, because we need the cost for energy to go down. We need renewable energies. And that's why we need to be more pragmatic here. And some ideas that are floating around in the parliament, ban of certain chemicals, these chemicals are necessary for the transition, for example, for hydrogen. So the second part of my message, the first is support those in need, and that's a legal obligation. But second, also prioritize energy and climate so that we can do it and that it is not too expensive.
I see. So it's quite difficult to find that line between balancing environmental concerns while also meeting our climate objectives. Going forward, what we'd like to see the EU do to tackle climate change in the future, what kind of commitments can we expect from the EU at the next climate action plans?
Yeah, the next point that we will have to discuss is our 2040 target, and in connection with that, at international level, also a 2035 target. So what comes after Fit for 55, after our legislation for 2030. And here, I think we need to be ambitious, but it's also clear we have a scientific advisory board that the European Parliament pushed for, and they say we need to use all technologies. You know, personally, I'm not a fan of nuclear, but I think those member states that use nuclear for the moment shouldn't phase out. Germany did a mistake after the war started. We should have changed our policy. It's now almost too late, but other countries should not phase out nuclear. We should use all the possibilities. Biomass is disputed, but it's necessary. And the most important thing that we have to do is negative emissions. There are companies already now that take the CO2 from the air and create bricks from this. It's horribly expensive, but they are starting this, and we need to support them. We need to create a market. You know, 30 years ago, photovoltaic, so creating electricity from the sun was horribly expensive. Now it's cheap. So when you start this technology, it becomes less expensive. And I think, and that's also what the International Panel on Climate Change says, this is the key challenge now, that we invest in these negative emissions.
Absolutely. I mean, there's already been reports that in a few years, perhaps we might already overshoot the Paris climate targets. So it's important that we also extract emissions from the atmosphere. Just a reminder to our audience, if you have any questions you'd like to submit, please just put them in the chat, and our community engagement people will send them through to me. Just a couple more questions for you, if I could. Ahead of COP28, Parliament adopted this resolution, as I mentioned earlier, calling on all countries to strengthen their climate commitments and to contribute their fair share to increase international climate financing. You mentioned a bit of this earlier on, but how can they accomplish this more concretely?
Yeah, the European Union is a frontrunner. We contribute more than our fair share for climate financing. Others, like Japan, United States, Australia, are not doing what they should do, and that's why we are delayed. So we constantly talk to these countries, and also the oil countries, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, they should really start to do their bit. That's the first point. More important is the mitigation. You know, the European Union, people say we are not ambitious enough. Our 55% or 57% is not bringing us to 1.5 degrees. That is under the assumption that the rest of the world has not the same responsibility. And here I see the biggest challenge with China and the United States. In the United States, we all appreciate that Biden is active and he's not like Trump, completely ignoring the climate. But the target of the United States, what they have is 50% with a base year 2005. And this will lead to 2.5 times more per capita emissions than in the European Union. So there's a huge challenge. Would the United States have the cars and the buildings and the industry that we have in Europe, they would have less than 50% of their emissions already today. So this is important to put pressure. And that's why we need these market-based mechanisms, including the border tax adjustment, to make a clear signal. You know, who doesn't decarbonize will not be able to deliver goods to Europe. Also, the consumers play a role. You know, when I speak to third countries and they say, "Oh, you are going to punish us with our steel industry," I also say, the customers, they ask for climate-neutral products. That's why this power is also important. Whatever politicians do can be challenged at courts. But if you say, "I want a car that is CO2 neutral," also when it comes to the steel in this car, no market in the world can ignore it.
It's interesting you mentioned the consumer, because we just had a question from the audience, and they are concerned basically, how can we ensure that people in the EU will not get poorer with these measures? Is the EU not pushing too far? If the rest of the world does not follow, only Europeans will pay for that. That's one of the comments we have.
Yeah, for the moment, people are getting poorer because we relied too much on fossil fuels. You know, what happened in the last 2 years is that gas became extraordinarily expensive. The Russians started the war already before they made this invasion in Ukraine, because they started a war on energy. They emptied the store, and that's why the price already went up in 2021. And it's a fossil fuel dependency inflation that we have. So would we have invested in clean technologies, non-fossil technologies, mainly renewables and energy efficiency, and where it is accepted also nuclear, we wouldn't have this price increase. So climate policy would have been the cheaper options. But to be honest, that's not always the case. Sometimes we also need to invest to protect our children and grandchildren. And then it's important that we put the burden on those that can afford. So as I said, me as an MEP, I want to buy an electrical car and I will do it. I can afford it, even if it's not supported by the states. But others can't do, and that's why the support must be focused on these people.
I see. We still have 1 or 2 minutes left, so if there's any last-minute questions, please send them through now. So one more for you, sir. What do you feel is the current state of play on global efforts to combat climate change and to meeting climate targets such as the Paris Climate Agreement, and by the EU itself, such as achieving climate neutrality by 2050?
Yeah, so there's light and shadow, like always in life. Many countries in the last 5 years have followed the European Union. We started to say we want to be climate neutral by 2050. And the election in Poland was really, really helpful in that, because the new government will also support climate policy. They will have a national target also on climate neutrality. Many member states, like the Scandinavians, like Austria, like Germany, have already an earlier climate neutrality target. So we are making a lot of progress, and almost everybody in the world follows, but some follow too slow and too late. China has a climate neutrality target for 2060, and that's way too late. And yeah, that's why we need to make progress at international level, and we need to be reliable and credible when we speak about our own targets. We need to not only have this 2030 legislation, but also for the next 2 decades, a clear plan how we will get there.
I see. Okay, I think we've just about run out of time, so we'll leave that there for today. So I'd just like to thank you for joining us today for this very engaging interview, and thank you everyone for joining us for this live. If you would like to find more information about what the Parliament and the EU is doing about climate change, you can find more information on our website or follow our social media channels. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Great.